Ala Rasulillah wa ba'd. So Alhamdulillah, we're going to get started immediately since we have only till 9:30, and there's a lot to discuss. So just a disclaimer that this talk is going to be a little bit more academically intensive. It's not a normal talk, which is usually like, more of a kind of reminders and kind of preaching, because this is a talk which requires a lot of science. It requires a lot of legal discussions. So just so you know, it's going to be a lot of statistics, a lot of interpretation and things like that. So that's just my disclaimer before I begin. So let's get started. So abortion has become a pretty hot topic. This is not something that Muslims have not been discussing. They've been discussing it for over 1,000 years. And Muslim scholars have been discussing the recent manifestations of abortion in modern times for several decades, since the 1930s, 1920s, and prior to that. So the reason why it's become a hot topic is because it's a part of the American political debate right now, with regards to what's happening in Alabama and the new law that was passed, and with regards to Georgia and other states, and the Conservative Party. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. But primarily, we're not here to discuss the political aspect. We're primarily here to discuss the Islamic perspective on abortion as a whole. So with that said, let's define abortion. So abortion, according to its technical definition, is basically to end a pregnancy through the removal or the expulsion of an embryo or a fetus. Right? And the embryo basically becomes a fetus at around somewhere between 5 to 11 weeks of pregnancy. So how many abortions are taking place in the world today? Well, there's approximately 205 million pregnancies every year in the world today. 1/3 of those pregnancies are unintended, meaning that the couple was not interested, like they did not have the intention to actually, get pregnant, but they did, and 1/5 of those pregnancies end up in abortion. So 20% of all pregnancies in the world today end up in abortion. So we're looking at about 56 million abortions are performed per year. And if you look at the difference between the countries, 26% of them are in developed countries, and 20% of them are in the quote-unquote developing countries. So there's not that big of a difference. It's almost, it's very close. So this is not a first world problem. It's not a quote-unquote third world, fourth world developing country problem or issue. It is something that is equally across the board. 45% of those abortions that I mentioned, out of the 56 million, 45% of them are performed unsafely. And because they're done unsafely, we're looking at 70,000 deaths per year because of unsafe abortions. And the statistics say that there's about 5 million disabilities per year because of those unsafe practices of abortion taking place. So that's a lot of abortions happening throughout the world. So how is abortion actually done? Well, this is not a new issue. This is something that has been done throughout history. Obviously, it changes over time. But you have abortion being performed through herbal medicines, through using sharp instruments and people reaching in and killing the fetus, or forceful massage on the woman's stomach, which ends up killing the fetus as well. There's been many different procedures for abortion throughout history. We have recorded instances of abortion from China, ancient China, from 2700 BCE. We have recorded instances from ancient Egypt, 1550 BCE, from Rome in 200 CE. So this is something that is well known. It's not something new. Hippocrates, in his manuals on medicine, he refers to abortion. The philosopher Aristotle, he refers to abortion. And there's many, many other references regarding these things. So the way in which it's done today is usually primarily through two means. Number one is by taking a drug. So the woman will take a drug. It's usually going to be mifepristone and a combination of a prostaglandin analog. she'll take it and it'll abort the fetus, or it will be done through surgery. And surgery, they use a suction device and they suck out the fetus so that it dies. It's not living anymore because it cannot survive outside the womb independently. Why do people perform abortions? Well, there's a number of reasons, so we'll kind of categorize them. Number one, people are not ready to have more kids. They're not ready for kids in the first place, or they're not ready to have more kids. They say we have more than enough kids and it's going to be very challenging to get more, so therefore we want to have an abortion. There are marriage problems. And they say we're going to bring a child into a marriage where we have very severe marriage problems. We don't even know if this marriage is going to last. We're going to bring a child into that relationship. Or divorce. So a woman is pregnant and then there's a divorce that takes place. And they say, well, why should we have this child? We're not even a couple anymore. And other people, another reason is they say that they cannot afford to raise a child. So it costs too much money. So I remember having a discussion with one of my friends. He's not a Muslim, but he's telling me basically, he calculated. He says basically each child costs about $1 million. If you calculate and factor in university costs and healthcare costs all the way to get them to adulthood, it's going to cost $1 million. And then once they turn 21, you're not going to see them anymore. Again, he's not Muslim, right? So family values are different. But he says, what's the point? You know how much I could do with $1 million adjusted for inflation? So people have this idea that it's very, very expensive to raise a child, so therefore they don't want to invest that money. And the other reason for abortion is that they wanted a different gender or they wanted a different race. So they didn't get the race that they wanted, they didn't get the gender that they wanted. Now, this is obviously not always the case with married couples when it comes to race. Obviously, you know who you're marrying, but this is usually the case outside of wedlock. In terms of gender, generally, it is the females that are going to be aborted, because in some societies still until today, people want to have a male, which was something more common in the past, but it still exists today, and I'm going to come back to that point. So these are kind of like the base reasons on why people want to have an abortion. Then there's a second level. The second level is someone is engaged in fornication or adultery. They want to conceal that. So if they're married and they slept with somebody else, they don't want to get caught that they had a relationship with someone else. Or they were just in a non-marriage relationship. Now they're pregnant, they don't want people to know. So therefore they're going to try to cover up the fact that they were actually engaged in relationships, and they want to cover that up. So that's a second category of a reason. Third category is due to rape or due to incest. So the mentality is very different. The difference is that we don't want to have this stigma or burden of raising a child that's a result of either rape or that's a result of incest, whether it was consensual incest or not consensual incest. This is your own family member, and now what is society going to think? So that's another reason for it. Fourth category is due to deformities. So having deformities or severe deformities in a child is a fourth category of reason why people want to have abortions. And category number 5 is risk to the health of the mother or the life of the mother. So this is across the board. Pretty much these are most of the reasons why people want to have an abortion in the first place. Okay? So that's important to understand when we get to the Islamic discussion. So what status does a fetus have from an Islamic perspective? Right? This is a very important part of the question. So the first thing is Islam prohibits murder of human beings. Right? This is pretty clear. Allah says in the Quran, "And do not kill the soul which Allah has forbidden to be killed except in the course of justice." So you're not allowed to kill someone. Now, usually when we talk about murder, we're talking about adults. So what does Islam say about killing children? It's in the same category, if not worse. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in chapter 17, verse 31, He says, وَلَا تَقْتُلُوا أَوْلَادَكُمْ خَشْيَةَ إِمْلَاقٍ. Do not kill your children for fear of poverty. And then he explains, he continues, he says, we will provide sustenance for them as well as for you. Indeed, the killing of them is a great sin. So Allah mentions this as كَانَ خِطَأً كَبِيرًا. It is a great sin. So what used to happen in the past is, in Arabian society and in many other cultures, that if someone felt that they could not raise their children because it's too costly, because it costs a lot of money, not $1 million like we talked about, but it was viewed as something that is going to take away from your financial ability, or it's just going to be a big burden on you, then they would end up actually killing some of their children. Usually tends to be the females that were killed off, because the perception was that the male is able to fight in battle, and the male is able to go out and do business and trading because of the nature of the society, whereas the female cannot do that. So when it comes to militarily and economically, there's a disadvantage, especially in olden times. So they would kill their children, and Allah came and revealed the verse and forbade that. And then there's another verse where it mentions how severe that is, and it says, and when the girl who was buried alive will be asked for what sin was she killed. Chapter 81, verses 8 to 9. So basically, Allah emphasizes, He says, on the Day of Judgment, people are going to have to be held, they're going to be held accountable. And they're going to be asked, why was this little girl killed alive? What sin? What did she do wrong? How could you take the life of that child? So what's happening here is that when it comes to a human being, murder is prohibited. When it comes to a child, murder is prohibited. But then the question arises. The question is, what status does a fetus have? Does a fetus fall into the category of a human being? Does it fall into the category of a child, like a 1-year-old child? Or does it fall into some different category? So this is a discussion that not only Muslims have had or having, it's a discussion which many other religions, many other philosophers have discussed. So the question is this, is that why is murder prohibited against a person, right? When we call a person or a human being, right? What differentiates between killing an animal versus killing a human being, right? Are they equivalent? If you kill an animal, if you kill a cat, is it the same as killing a human being? No. For most people, it's not. For some people, it is. PETA, for the people, for the ethical treatment of animals and all that stuff, they have some equivalency, but generally not. So the idea is this, that the question has to be answered. What status does a fetus have? Does a fetus have this exact same status as a human being, like a child that's born, or does it not? Because we differentiate between human beings and animals. We differentiate between plants. So then the question is this. If you're not allowed to kill a human being in Islam, are you allowed to kill animals for no reason? You're not. Are you allowed to kill plants for no reason? You're not. So the thing is, all three of them are living beings. But when you kill one of them, they don't have the same status. A human doesn't have the same status as an animal, and an animal doesn't have the same status as a plant. And perhaps animals don't have the same status within themselves. So if you're killing a dog or a horse or an ape, it's very different than killing an ant or a cockroach or something else. So the question is why, right? What is the reason behind the difference? So that needs to be clarified. That needs to be thought through, and that plays a role in terms of what status we give to a fetus. So there's a lot of different thoughts, right? So some people have said, some philosophers have said, that it's because it has a life. So an embryo, a fetus, has a life, therefore it's like a human being. It's like a 1-day-old child. So what's the difference between a 1-day-old child and an 8-month fetus, right? Well, you say, well, they both have life. The problem with that explanation is an animal has life too. So why does an animal fall into the same category? And if you say, well, a plant has life too, why doesn't a plant fall in the same category? They don't. We acknowledge that they don't fall in the same category. So this is not a sufficient answer to say that life is the reason behind it. So then there's a second explanation. The second explanation is it's because one of them has the ability to think like a human being. So if the difference between an animal and a human and a plant is that the human being can think very different from an animal, very different from a plant, right? So the cognitive faculties are very different. So you say, therefore, that's why we make a differentiation between the three. And since a fetus has the potential to become a human being that's going to think, we're also going to give it certain amount of rights, or it has a special status, like the status of a human being. The problem with that argument is it doesn't stand either. The reason why it doesn't stand is if somebody becomes incapacitated in terms of their brain function, do we put them in the same category as an animal where if we kill them off, there's not going to be accountability for that? So that becomes a problem from that perspective as well. Then you have the third answer, and the third answer is that the thing that differentiates them is a soul. So if a human being has a soul, and that soul has been given to it by God, and God is going to hold those people accountable in terms of once they mature and become adults, if they make it to adulthood, then that soul is what's going to become responsible. That soul is going to make moral decisions between what's right and what's wrong. So there's going to be judgment, there's going to be responsibility. Animals don't have that responsibility. Plants don't have that responsibility. So it's not just life, it's actually a soul, and there's moral accountability or potential moral accountability in the future that's going to exist. So from a religious perspective, from an Islamic perspective, that becomes a core part of the discussion. That a fetus has a very different status than even a developed animal, because it is a potential person that is going to have that moral capacity. The problem on the other side is when there's a discussion in American politics, when there's a discussion on the United Nations front, you have many people who do not adhere to any religion. And if they do not adhere to religion, or they're not very concerned about religion, they don't believe in a soul. And if you don't believe in a soul, then what's going to happen? The entire discussion is going to be around defining what is life, defining what is, cognizance in terms of intellectual capacity, right? And using all of these other factors and markers. So if you go and look at any university in the Western world, for example, in a secular university, most of the discussions about abortion, about rights, about human rights, about the rights of humans, about the rights of animals, about the rights of the environment and plants, and about the rights of a fetus or a zygote or whatever it may be, blastocyst, whatever stage it is, it's not going to be grounded in the idea of a soul existing within that thing, because there's no religious framework. It's a secular discussion. So when you remove God, and you remove the soul, and you remove accountability from the picture, your entire discussion has to change and flip. And that's what we're seeing today, particularly in America. So that's just some philosophy as well. People have been discussing this for a long time. So Aristotle wrote in his book Politics around the year 350 BCE. He said the line between lawful and unlawful abortion will be marked by the fact of having sensation and being alive. Again, Aristotle believed in God, but he did not have like a religion, right? He did not have Christianity, he did not have Judaism, he did not have Islam. Allah knows best what was in his heart. So his explanation is this, that if this fetus has sensation, right, it can sense either something around it, or in today's discussion, it can feel pain, then we're going to give it a special status. If it cannot feel pain, we're going to remove that special status from it. The second point he says, and it's alive. So alive part doesn't really work, right? Because the definition of life is, very different between plants, animals, and human beings. So Muslim scholars also had a problem trying to figure out what status does a fetus have. The reason why is because even when they believe that the fetus has a soul, and I'm going to talk about 120 days, after 120 days, all Muslim scholars agree that the fetus has a soul, and the soul is breathed into that fetus. The discussion among Muslim scholars has been that if the fetus dies after 4 months, after 120 days, are we going to give it a name or not? Imam Abu Hanifa and the scholars from the Hanafi school of thought said, no, that we're not. Are we going to give it a burial the way that we're going to bury a one-day-old child? Or are we going to differentiate between the two? A child that died before it was delivered and a child that died after it was delivered. Is there a differentiation between the two? So you find Muslim scholars like Imam Abu Hanifa saying that there is a differentiation. We're not going to give it the same type of burial. The same question was, can a fetus own property? So what can happen is, a 1-day-old child that has been delivered, it's allowed to own property, right? In the sense that if it dies and it had property in its name, what's going to happen? That property is going to be inherited to its heirs. It's going to be inherited to maybe its siblings, maybe its parents. Obviously, there's no children in the case 1-day-old child. So there's an aspect of inheritance that's going to play a role. Then there was another question that came. So what's happening is, even though it had a soul, it was not given the same status as a 1-day-old child that has actually come in. So there's a differentiation between the status. And then in Islamic law, there was another question during the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that there was a woman who was killed and she was pregnant. And what happened was, when you're killed by someone, accidental killing or whatever, there is a blood money that is due. So because the woman was killed and the child was killed, does that count as killing two people, or you have to pay double the blood money? Or does it not count as a full blood money? So what happened was, one of the rulings, now I'm not going to discuss the authenticity of this hadith, but this is there in classical 1400 years ago Islamic discussions, that they said that the miscarried fetus, which was forcefully killed because of the death of the mother, intentionally done, it carries 1/10 the value of the blood money that was supposed to be paid. So what does that mean? I know I'm getting very philosophical, so I hope I'm not losing everyone, but basically what's happening here is, we're talking about a fetus that has not been born. 1 day before it's been born, if it dies, it has a different status than 1 day after it's born. So there is a dividing line between birth and between non-birth, even though the soul exists within that fetus already. So these are some of the markers that we're talking about. So just keep that in mind when we get into this discussion now. So whenever we're trying to figure something out in Islam, what we do is we go back to the Quran and we go back to the Sunnah. We go back to the Quran and we say, okay, where does it clearly tell us exactly when a human being becomes a human being such that it becomes murder to kill that child, right, under any circumstance, and that they have the exact same value as a 1-day-old child. So a 1-day-old child has the same value as a 100-year-old person. Has the same value as a 10-year-old, has the same value as a 20-year-old, right? From the perspective of killing them, right? Or eliminating their existence. So what's going to happen now is we need to figure out somehow what guidance do we have, what indications do we have to figure out where does that fetus, what kind of right does it get as compared to a human being that has been born, or a person, right? So the issue is, it is not clearly specified in the Quran exactly what that is. So what that means is we have to reason it out. We have to figure it out. And there's many things in the Quran, there's many rules in Islam that are not 100% clear-cut, but you have to use your mind to figure it out, because Allah wanted you to put some effort into it. So this is what Muslim scholars have been doing for centuries, right? They put their effort in, they try and figure it out. Just like everything else in life. Science, you got to figure it out, you got to do some research, you got to do some experimentation. Someone writes a book, you want to understand the details of what they're writing, you have to try to put some effort into it, you got to figure it out. So when it comes to the Quran, because it's not specified, we have one verse, or 3 verses, that talk about the creation of human beings. Chapter 23, verse 12. It says that, I'll just read you the English. We created man from an extract of clay. We created human beings from an extract of clay. Then we placed them as a sperm drop in a firm lodging. And then we made the sperm drop into a clinging clot. And then we made the clot into a lump of flesh. We made from the lump of flesh bones. And then we covered the bones with flesh. Then we developed that thing into another creation. So blessed is Allah, the best of creators. So it explains the stages of the embryo going into the fetus and beginning to develop in the womb of the mother, at a time where no one really understood any of this, right? No one knew any of this. But it doesn't give us the exact time, the exact moment where one status turns into another status. So that needs to be reasoned out. That's not clear-cut mentioned in the Quran. So what do? We go to the hadith. We go to the statements and the sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, where we try to figure out, well, where is that dividing line? Is it from the beginning? Is it from fertilization of the sperm and the egg? Is it something beyond that? Is it before birth? Where do we draw those lines? So what we have is, we have statements of the Prophet, peace be upon him, which mention something very similar to what the Quran is saying, but it actually mentions time periods. So one of them, from Sahih Bukhari, Sahih Muslim's authentic, is very highly authentic hadith. It says, the creation of every one of you starts with the process of collecting the material for his body within 40 days and 40 nights in the womb of his mother. So it's 40 days and 40 nights. It says, then it becomes a clot of congealed blood for a similar period. So what was the period? 40 days. Okay? How many days are we at? 80. Okay. And then it becomes like a piece of flesh for a similar period. How many days are we at? 120. Then an angel is sent to him by Allah, and the angel is allowed to write down 4 things. What is the livelihood going to be of this person? What is when are they going to die? What are their deeds going to be like? Are they going to be wretched? Are they going to be blessed? And then the soul is breathed into that thing. At how many days? 120 days. Now that's one set of hadiths that we have in the same collections of Bukhari and Muslim. Now what happened is, you have different narrations of the exact same hadith. And the different narrations have been interpreted by different scholars in 2 different ways. The first one is what I just said to you. So the similar period means we have 40, and we add 40, and we add 40, and we get 120. The other narrations of the hadith, according to some scholars, said that the similar period doesn't mean that you add them. It means that all of these things are happening in the exact same 40-day period. You see the issue? You see what's happening? Same hadiths, same narrations, same collections of Bukhari and Muslim, and you're getting 2 interpretations. So what has happened now is, the question is it 40 days for each stage, or is it 40 days in total? Because what we have is, at the end, the soul is breathed into that fetus. So is the soul going to be breathed in at 40 days, or is it going to be breathed at 120 days? Now what you have is, the majority of scholars throughout history have said it is 120 days. And a minority of scholars have said it is 40 days. Right? So what you're going to get is these 2 markers, or these 2 timestamps over here. Now, you can sit here and analyze this hadith and look at the science and say, okay, well, wait a minute. It was assumed that osteogenesis, which is the development of the bones, it was believed to be at the 17th week. But that's not the case. The development of the bones, osteogenesis, actually develops around the 6th week, which is at 40 days. But what did the Quran actually mean when it described that? What did the Prophet, peace be upon him, actually mean when he described that? Becomes a discussion. Okay? So because we have something that is not 100% clear-cut, we have like a gray area, but we have at least a framework through which we can work with. Okay? So that's the framework, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Now if we want to set this discussion up, the first thing about, now that we have these 2 timestamps, I'm going to come back to that. Setting up the discussion, first of all, let's talk about procreation. So what does Allah say about procreation from an Islamic perspective? Okay, without going into all the evidences and all the detail, we can say that Islam encourages people to have children. Okay, having children is something which is encouraged. Why? Because you raise them correctly, you raise them right. You have actually brought into the world, by the permission of Allah, a child who you can shape. Hopefully, if you're a righteous person and you're putting the time and the effort into them, right? You will shape someone and you will raise someone who will become an asset to society. So not only is it a need so that the human race doesn't die out, but the goal is that Islam teaches that it's a correct religion. It has the absolute values. And if Muslims are going to follow Islam, then if they're producing and they're raising righteous children, what's going to happen? They're going to bring more goodness into the world, or potential goodness, right? That's the hope. So the encouragement to have children is there in Islam. Okay, it's not just something like, you know what, it's if you feel like it, you have children. No, it's not just if you feel like it, you have children. Having children is actually something that is encouraged in Islam. But on the flip side, you have contraception. Okay, So the idea of contraception is something which is allowed in Islam. So for example, if you look at other religions, you look at the Catholic religion, you look at the Mormon religion, they have the same thing, high emphasis on having children, for the same reasons that Islam emphasizes having children. But there's a strong discouragement against contraception in many of the other religions out there. When it comes to Islam, contraception is something that is allowed. It's been allowed since the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and there's a reasoning for it. The reasoning for it is not because it's not encouraged to have children. It's because raising lots of children the right way may prove to be difficult. It may affect the health of the mother to have too many pregnancies, right? So therefore it can become a problem. Or maybe, the father is going to be absent, or maybe the mother is going to be absent, doesn't want the child or something like that. So the idea of contraception is something which has been allowed in Islam. It's been agreed upon, for a very long time. But there's one restriction. And the only restriction, the main restriction of a reason for contraception that scholars have discussed is they say that it should not be done out of fear of poverty. Why? Because the verse that I quoted to you before, it says, do not kill your children out of fear of poverty, we will take care of them and you. Meaning, if Allah said that you should not be concerned about this because Allah is going to take care of that part, fear of poverty should not be a valid reason for contraception, which is what I mentioned in the beginning, is one of the very common reasons for why people want to have an abortion in the first place, right? The $1 million child, being raised in this society. That should not be the reason, right? So that's number one. Number two, contraception should be, well, let me give you the hadith. Jabir ibn Abdullah, may Allah's peace be upon him, he's a companion of the Prophet, he says that we used to perform azl or coitus interruptus during the lifetime of the Messenger of Allah. And if it was something that was punishable, if it was something that was not allowed in Islam, the Quran would have prohibited us from doing so. So meaning it's clear cut, the Prophet knew that this is what we're doing and he allowed it, right? So this is not an issue. As long as the contraception is reversible, it's not permanent, and as long as it's done prior to fertilization, it is allowed, pretty much agreement for the most part. The last condition on contraception is that both spouses are supposed to agree. This is not a unanimous thing because both spouses, when they're married, they both have a right to children. So it needs to be done with the permission of both. So that is procreation, okay? Now what happens is that if contraception fails, if it doesn't work, right, which in many cases it doesn't, meaning that you didn't have the intention to do so or you didn't use it in the first place, then what will happen is when pregnancy occurs and fertilization takes place, people are going to say, well, it was God's will that the contraception didn't work. Or it was God's will that we didn't want to get pregnant, but we got pregnant. So now what do we do about that? So one way of people's general thinking is, for many Muslims, is that if it's God's will, then because it's God's will, we have to stop it. We cannot interfere with it at all because this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had planned. The problem with that is if it was God's will, then we wouldn't be using contraception as well, right? The way that we have to understand when we say something is the will of God, everything is the will of God. Everything that happens from an Islamic perspective is the will of God. So when we get sick, do we just remain sick and we say this was the will of God? No, we take some medicine. We're allowed to take some medicine. The Prophet, peace be upon him, said that as well. So what we can do is we're allowed to utilize means to rectify a condition that we don't necessarily want to be in, but we don't put our faith in that cause per se, if we're allowed to do it, right? So this is something that happened before. When Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second, may Allah's peace be with him, he was the second Khalifa, a very important companion of the Prophet, peace be upon him. When he was traveling, he was going to a land that was hit by the plague. And what happened was, when he was told that the plague is in this area, he decided he's going to turn around. So one of the companions criticized him and said, are you running away from the will of God? And he said, yes, I'm running away from the will of God to the will of God. Right? So what he meant was that everything's going to happen by the will of God. But if I'm leaving, that doesn't mean that I'm going against the will of God. I'm supposed to utilize the means. So this is, I wanted to address that part of the discussion as well. Okay? Moving on. Muslim scholarship. Okay? What has Islamic scholarship said about abortion, past and present? First of all, let me define something. Why is it even important? There's a lot of people who are like, why do we even care what scholars have to say? We should just go directly to the Quran and Sunnah and figure it out ourselves, right? Or we should just figure out what Islam says according to us. We don't need to see what other people have to say. They're human beings, and we're human beings, and all opinions are the same. The thing is, this is not that Muslim scholars, historically, past or present, it doesn't mean that they're infallible. There's no ordained clergy in Islam where, you have to listen to them. But the idea of studying the intellectual thought of people who have put in time and effort to try to understand a circumstance or understand an issue is very important. We do this in all fields. We study what people of the past have said with regards to medicine, with regards to economics, with regards to politics, rather than just saying, I don't need to read what anyone has to say about the subject. I'm going to figure it out all on my own. Actually going through, number one, will give us an interpretive method to see how we approach the issue of abortion. And number two, oftentimes people who are living in a period or living in a certain era, they can tend to have either their own biases or their own emotions alter their perception of things and make them more subjective and less objective. So when you see someone who's outside of your own context trying to understand the same issue but from a different perspective, you can actually learn a lot from them. So that's why we study intellectual thought. So what if Muslim scholars had to say regarding abortion? They put them into different stages. So they say stage number one, okay, is from fertilization to 40 days or 42 days. I'm not going to get into why 42, but we saw the number 40 from the hadith, right? So from fertilization to 40 days, right, what's happening is that you have scholars saying that abortion should still not be done unless you have a good reason to do so. Okay, so this is the general opinion. You should have a good reason if you're going to perform an abortion. So I'm not going to get into too many differences of opinion, but what are good reasons for an abortion during this stage, from fertilization to 40 days? So some of them, I'll tell you some good reasons and some bad reasons, right? The worst reason would be fear of poverty. Why? Because if you're not allowed to do contraception due to fear of poverty, you're not allowed to do abortion due to fear of poverty, because of the verse that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has mentioned regarding that, and the general emphasis that, things will be taken care of. That should not be the biggest concern that you have, right? The second, there's a good statement by Dr. Hatim al-Hajj, one of the scholars in America, and he's a medical practitioner by profession. He says, abortion in the first 40 days of pregnancy, upon the mutual agreement of both parents, is permissible for a legitimate cause, such as the woman's fear of not having the capacity to raise a newborn child. So there's a difference between fear of poverty and just being so overwhelmed to the point where I'm not going to be able to take care of this child properly. But let's finish his statement. He says, having said that, it is always preferable to avoid that. And if one relies on Allah's help and puts his or her trust in Him, He will not let them down, and that fetus may become their favorite child one day. If you look at it from that perspective. So basically what it says is that, you know what? You have a potential valid reason for aborting that fetus during this time, but it's not recommended to do so. In fact, what's recommended is to try and overcome that obstacle. Feeling a little bit overwhelmed, feeling a little bit stressed out, you're really busy with a lot of things, you should try to overcome that as a recommendation. But if you can't, you have the permission, you have the option to do that abortion at that time, because this would be an example of a valid reason. Let me give you an example of a not very good valid reason. So, in many countries in Asia, there's a preference for I mentioned preference for male children in history. So in many countries, particularly in Taiwan, South Korea, India, and China, What happens is there's a preference for male children, and abortion is used as a reason to actually get rid of female fetuses so that they can go and keep on trying in order to have a male. Is this a good reason to do an abortion even if it's prior to 40 days? It is not. It is not a good reason. So what I want to clarify is there are good reasons, there are bad reasons, and even if there's a good reason, it's still recommended to continue even if you have like some kind of good reason of maybe not being able to take care of it. Another common reason during this time is getting an abortion due to divorce or family problems. Again, now this is going to depend on how bad the situation is, how much, tension is there, what effect is this going to actually have on the family in terms of the divorce, are they fighting this out in court, all of that. So this should not necessarily be something where people say, well, there's no way. I mean, I have to get an abortion because we're divorced now. Well, why? A child can survive. I mean, the child still has two parents. Even if one, whether they have joint custody or they have, shared, whether they have single custody or whatever it is, the recommendation, as mentioned by Dr. Hatim al-Hajj and many other scholars, the recommendation is to continue. Can it be a justification prior to 40 days? Yes, it can. But it's not the recommendation. So hopefully we're clear on this so far. Now, that is when it comes to 40 days. Now we have the second stage. The first stage is basically fertilization is taking place, right? And the embryo is turning into a fetus. The second stage is where it's developed, what's called takhalluq, where the features have now developed. It's either 40, 42 days, up to 120 days. Okay? So now this period here, we have two things going on. Number one, as I mentioned before, the interpretation of the hadith on whether the soul is coming in or not. So there's two issues here. One is, has the soul come in at 40 days or is it going to come in at 120 days? And the second issue is, even if the soul comes in at 120 days, you have the development, the physical development has taken place now. So that physical development, when it reaches that stage, there is a different level that that fetus has reached, such that even people who say that there's still no soul, there's a difference between abortion prior to the 40 days and after the 40 days, even though in both cases it has no soul. So you say, well, why? If it has no soul, what's the difference? The difference is the same thing when we talked about animals. Why is there a difference between killing of an ape and killing of an ant? Why is there a difference between killing of an animal and killing of a plant? They're both living things, but they're different development of those living things. So there's a different status in which it gets to. So some of this, what the scholars have basically said is that if you have no good reason to abort, if you have no reason, it should not even be done before 40 days. But if you do it after 40 days, it's worse. So you shouldn't be doing it before 40 days, but it's worse if you do it after 40 days. Now the question is, when do you have an exception? Okay? So an exception has to be an exception that is higher than the exceptions before 40 days. So what are the exceptions before 40 days? It's going to be very, very difficult to take care of this child. Divorce is going to be very, very ugly, and all of these things are going to happen. So now the excuse, it has to be elevated. It should not be, I'm in medical school. It's going to be very hard. My class is going to be difficult if I have a child and this and that. That's now that excuse before 40 days has changed. That excuse is not going to be sufficient anymore because it's after 40 days. So the excuse now needs to change. So what are those excuses? They're not 100% clear-cut, but I'll give you some examples of what they are. Okay, there should be a pressing need now. Okay, that pressing need usually is there's going to be a severe deformity in the child. Not just a slight, something is going to be wrong. It's going to be born without a finger, right? Let's just abort the child. It's going to be some severe deformity that's going to significantly affect that child. Or number two, there was rape or there was incest that's going to happen, and that's potentially going to cause a very severe effect on the child and their life and the mother and the family and all of these other things, right? So these are two examples of when there would be an exception between 40 days and 120 days. Now, the question comes up, and this is a very sticky, it's a very tricky question, but we have to ask these questions. And that is it better to continue that pregnancy if there is a deformity, depending on the level of the deformity? Is it better to continue the pregnancy if it was a result of unwanted rape? Is it better to continue the pregnancy if it was a result of incest, whether planned or unplanned or whatever it is? Right? So that's where it becomes very challenging, and I'm going to tell you why it becomes challenging. So hear me clearly, is that these are legitimate reasons, according to many scholars, to abort. But the question is, what is the recommendation? Right? Some people are like, I want to go with, just tell me what is absolutely permissible, right? So say if it's allowed, I'm going to do that. Other people say if it's disliked and it's not haram, I'm going to do that. Right? That's not generally the attitude we should have as Muslims, right? The attitude is we should try to do whatever is we have to do what is mandatory. We're supposed to do what's recommended. Right? So the question is, what is recommended? Not what we want. If it's allowed or if it's disliked, that as long as it's not sinful, I'm going to do it. The question is, which one is recommended? So I'm going to give you some of what the scholars have said. So Shaykh Shaltut from Al-Azhar, rahimahullah, passed away quite a while ago, from Egypt. He makes an interesting argument. He says, on what basis, let's take a child with Down syndrome. Down syndrome is considered to be a severe deformity, a severe abnormality. So he says, on what basis are you going to abort this child with Down syndrome? So the common answer is going to be, well, it's going to be living a life of misery. Right? That's the normal answer, right? It's going to live a life of misery. So when it comes to Down syndrome, so on what basis are you saying that a child with Down syndrome is unhappy? Usually, if you ever dealt with children with Down syndrome, right, it's not necessarily the case. He's saying we project our perception of happiness onto another child. And you don't know exactly what that child is feeling, especially when it comes to Down syndrome. And what researchers say today is that Down syndrome, you can actually get a very decent quality of life. Even though the lifespan is cut short, on a case-by-case basis, you can get a very decent quality of life for that child. So on what basis did you abort it? You have to have some good reason. So what's your reason? Your reason is, oh, that child's going to be miserable. Well, that excuse is not really strong, per se, depending on the case of the deformity. So then what will happen is, it's a burden on me. Right? So if it's a burden on you, you see how that resembles khashyat imlaq, that fear of poverty. Allah's going to take care of you. That's not an issue. So the late Dr. Ahmad Saqr, may Allah be pleased with him, right? May Allah forgive him, have mercy on him. He makes an interesting argument. And he's a medical, professional as well. So he says, look, I know, he was not so much a legal scholar. So he says, I'm not speaking from the Islamic legal perspective. He says, I'm speaking from what we should be doing. Okay, so this is his argument. He says, when you go and you see a house being constructed in the middle of its construction, you're going to go and you're going to look around, you see all these parts all over the place, pieces everywhere, and you're like, oh man, this is horrible, it looks bad. And he says, if you just wait a little bit, what's going to happen? You see the finished house, and you fall in love with it. And you say, this is absolutely amazing. And he's saying that it's the same thing with a child. That child that has an abnormality, that child that has some kind of deformity, he says for many parents who decided that they're going to stick through it, that became their favorite child. That became something for them that they said, no, this is a child that's definitely worth raising. It's worth the effort. And his argument is, this could be your ticket to Jannah. It could be your ticket to paradise, right? So this is something that you may be rewarded for it. Why would you want to just terminate it? And the thing is, let's say your child is born healthy. After 1 month, it can be in a car accident and develop some deformity. What are you going to do in that case? You're going to abort it? Not necessarily. No, of course not, right? It's going to be murder. Not necessarily. Of course not. But what are you going to do? You're going to take care of it. Are you going to be like, too much of a burden. I'm just going to give it up for adoption, outside of this discussion of adoption, outside of the scope of this discussion. You're just going to give it to someone else, say, it's too much of a burden, I don't have time to take care of it. You're not going to do that, right? For the most part, right? You're still going to take care of it, and you're going to be rewarded for taking care of that. So he makes this argument, which is an interesting argument. Another Sheikh Jad al-Haq, who was the head of Al-Azhar several decades ago, he made a similar argument. He says that a deformity today, he says science is rapidly increasing in terms of technology and what we can do. A deformity today could be cured in a few years. It could be cured in a decade. And he says, how do you know? That may not become your favorite child and that deformity can be cured so that you got rid of that child. So these are some arguments in between, even though there's a permission to abort that child in those extreme deformity cases, right? That's not always necessarily the best route to take, okay? Stage 3 is after ensoulment, according to most scholars, 120 days. After 120 days, this fetus now is not a human being, but it has a soul. Therefore, it is impermissible to kill it. So it goes to the next level of impermissibility. The only time that this fetus can be killed would be with an extremely pressing need, which would only be in one case, and that is the life of the mother is in danger, right? So if the life of the mother is in danger, what ends up happening is you can only save one of them. So what do? You save the one that has a certain life already. The life already exists. This is a potential life. It's not been born yet. You don't know what's going to happen. So you choose the lesser of two evils in the situation. You go with the life of the mother. So that is the discussion there. So what you have is you have a range of permissibility in terms of the default on abortion is it should not be done. To the point of Maliki schools say it's absolutely prohibited. Should not be done at all unless it's to save the life of the mother. And then you have like the lenient Hanafi school that says no, you have any type of these excuses all the way up till 120 days. The excuses get more severe after 40 days. Less before 40 days, more severe after 40 days. After 120 days, only one exception, life of the mother. Okay. Now, all these days that I mentioned to you, don't get confused. So these are Islamic days, quote-unquote Islamic days. So physicians, they do not give you the numbers that I'm talking to you about right now. So physicians, they will give the date of pregnancy as the time of the last menstrual period of the woman. So what happens is, when they say 134 days, it is 120 days. So it's very similar to the Gregorian calendar and the lunar calendar, right? When you're paying your zakah, right, and you say, I pay my zakah every year. Which year do you pay? Do you pay it every 365 days? You're paying your zakah late. You should be paying every, how many days? How many days are in the Islamic lunar calendar? We've got a problem now. 354 days. So, 5 minutes, inshallah. 5-minute delay. Well, yes, inshallah. 9:40 is better, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair. Barakallah fiqh. It's okay? Inshallah, okay. All right, so I want to take questions as well. So what's happening is, be careful about that. The days are not the same, okay? So 134 days of pregnancy today, according to medical physicians, is actually 120 Islamic days of conception. Now let's move on to American politics, okay? There's this debate. The debate comes down to 3 variables. Number 1, is the embryo or fetus a human that has a right to life? Is it a person, which is what we just discussed? Number 2, does a woman get to decide what she does with her own body? Does she have ownership, in a sense, over that fetus because it's inside of her body? And number 3, is there a public health measure that the government can take in order to make some kind of population control, or to protect the lives of women, or to protect the lives of the embryo, right? So what happened was, the first countries to legalize abortion was Soviet Russia in 1919, Iceland in 1935, Sweden in 1938. So they're among the first countries to legalize certain or all forms of abortion. And what you find is these countries have something in common. What do they have in common? Huh? Old communities? No. Not just communism, but irreligious communities. Not very religious communities at all. Very secular communities, right? So 1973, we have Roe v. Wade, the landmark Supreme Court case, which basically said the following. It says, the Supreme Court says that during the first trimester of pregnancy, so they define these trimesters into periods, that during the first trimester, governments cannot prohibit abortions at all. During the second trimester, governments could require reasonable health regulations. And it said during the third trimester, abortions can be prohibited entirely so long as the laws contained exceptions for cases where they were necessary to save the life or the health of the mother. So what do you find? You find three divisions, different divisions than what Islam is saying, but three divisions that they're coming up with, right? The problem is the wording of their divisions are very different, and they're very loose and very malleable, okay? So what's happening now is, in America, you had 2018, Pew Research Institute did a survey. The survey was, how many of you want to legalize abortion completely? 25% of Americans. How many of you want to legalize most abortions? 34%. How many of you think most abortions should be illegal? 22%. How many of you think all abortion should be illegal? 15%. So what you see is America is pretty much divided across the board. Okay? But none of them have any discussion of these timestamps that Islam has put into place. That is not part of the discussion. That is not part of the survey. So what's happening is, where are Muslims in that Pew Research Institute survey? They shouldn't be in there in the first place, because they do not fall into any one of these four categories. And that becomes a problem for American Muslims who are trying to figure out, well, where do we stand? Well, I can tell you where you don't stand. You don't stand on that spectrum, because our spectrum is completely different. Our understanding of life and ensoulment and valid reasons and non-valid reasons and all of that is very, very different. So what you have is basically the Catholic Church is generally the most conservative, the most, conservative is not a good term, the most pro-life, in the sense that they say the moment conception happens, the moment fertilization takes place, that is equal to a human being, and it's murder to abort that child. Lutherans, evangelicals, the Church of England, Orthodox Jews, very, very similar stance as well. American Baptist churches, they condemn that form of abortion, but they don't take any public political stance, and they say we're not going to take a political stance. And some of the scholars have said we should take a very similar thing. We should have a religious stance, and we should not take a public political stance in American society, and that may be a good option potentially. So, and then there's other, very, liberal religions who say no, we should allow everything across the board. So when it comes to Islam, this discussion or debate in America between pro-life versus pro-choice. What does pro-life mean? Pro-life generally means that a fetus is equal to a human being, and if you kill it, it is equal to murder. Very clear cut. Pro-choice means it is a woman's decision whether she wants to continue her pregnancy up until whatever point, because as long as that child is inside her womb, up until 9 months before it's born, it's her right to do whatever she wants with it. And what's happening is these two groups, which are kind of here, where is Islam on the spectrum? It's in the middle somewhere, right? These two groups are fighting each other. If Muslims sit there and they ally themselves with one of these things, or they get caught up into the emotional rhetoric of one of these things, then they're actually going outside of the framework of Islam. So let me give you an example. Milla Jovovich is a famous actress. If you've ever seen Resident Evil, she did a pretty good acting job. But she basically had an abortion, and she's a staunch advocate who basically has set the framework and says, who are you to tell me what to do with my body? It is my decision, it is not your decision, and no one can tell me what to do with my body. So that is kind of the liberal perspective of, it's not your business, it's not your body, it's mine. The problem with that argument is, even when it comes to animals, if your neighbor is beating and torturing their dog, do you just be like, hey, it's my business, I can do whatever I want? Even if it's a dog, you're supposed to report them to the authorities, because even animal abuse and animal cruelty is not allowed, right? You have Hillary Clinton, when she was debating Donald Trump in the 2016, she was asked a question point blank. She says, why did you vote against the ban on late-term partial birth abortions? And her answer, she avoided the question. So Donald Trump said, yeah, she thinks it's okay to rip out a baby in the last month of pregnancy. And she avoided that question too. Right? So that's a very problematic stance, very similar to Milla Jovovich's stance. That liberal stance does not have any place in Islamic framework. Then you have the other side, which is basically we need to go and kill these abortion providers and bomb their Planned Parenthood clinics and all that because they're committing murder. We're not there either. So we're somewhere in between, in the middle. So my conclusion is this, is that there's a societal effect that needs to be taken into consideration. This is not just a legal discussion. Abortion should not be a primary means of birth control in Islam. Abortion should not be for personal or social convenience of what you feel like doing, right? There needs to be access to contraception education, which will actually reduce abortions, but it still does not solve the entire issue. As Muslims, we should denounce irresponsible sexual behavior and acts of violence that contribute to a large amount of abortions per year. So it's not just a legal discussion of what happens in abortion. It is a societal issue of all of these relationships that are taking place. Many of them are having all these abortions because of, one, lack of education, lack of not, knowing when to determine pregnancy, waiting until later periods, and because of the amount of relationships which are taking place. All right? So Islamic law has a principle. The principle is that whenever you can, you're supposed to prevent harm. You're supposed to prevent something bad. So if the mother's life is in danger, the principle of prevention of harm goes into place. But the Western ethical framework of preventing harm is very different from the Islamic ethical framework, because harm in a Western ethical framework has three main considerations. Number one, financial harm to the individual or to the family. Number two, emotional harm. And number three, independence harm, meaning taking away your independence to choose and having your freedom of choice. These three variables are not primarily considered in Islamic law discussions of harm. So I'll conclude by saying that we as a community need to invest our time and effort into more scholarly research to tackle these issues and to educate the Muslim community about where we really stand on abortion, because we neither stand on this side nor do we stand on that side. I'll open up for a few questions, inshallah ta'ala. Yes. Science cannot confirm anything. You said science, right? Science doesn't believe in a soul.
No, I'm not talking about the soul. The creation of the fetus. You said the hadith says the first 40 days this happened, the second 40 days this happened. What does science confirm? When is the bones created?
So the thing is, it depends on what level of bone structure, right? So it's not clear-cut in the hadith, therefore it's not clear-cut in science. Other questions? I expected a lot of questions, yes. Correct. So she should go for counseling in that case. So it should have been done before 120 because installment has taken place. I understand it's a very sensitive issue, very emotional issue. At the same time, it's important to understand Islam's perspective on the soul coming in definitely by 120 days, right? So that's why education is extremely important to prevent these difficult situations from occurring. Okay, yes. Yes. Yes, go ahead. When I say there's bad reasons, is it a valid reason? No, when I said bad reasons, it's invalid reason. Yeah.
So, like, say for example, like from 0 to 40 days, you have an abortion. Is it like haram or without any reason?
No, so 0 to 40 days, is it haram without any reason? Oh, without any reason, yes. Without any reason is prohibited. There needs to be a reason. What are the signs of installment? There's no signs. The signs are just coming from the text of Islam, the statement of the Prophet, peace be upon him. No, still would not be allowed. After 120 days, the only exception is going to be that the mother's life is in danger. Go ahead. It falls into the same category, whether she knows or she doesn't know. These are the markers. Exactly. Yes. It's almost like breaking your fast in Ramadan. You need a good reason, otherwise you're not supposed to break your fast, right? Mm. Right, alhamdulillah. So if you look at the pictures, it'll actually help you a lot. So depending on where it is, it becomes more and more living. Right. Yeah, we're gonna go pray, inshallah. Should we go and pray? What we'll do is we'll go and pray. Hold on. There's like a few more. So I'll tell you what I'll do is, brothers have no more questions, right? After the prayer, I'll walk over to the sisters. I'll walk over to the back of the masjid. Anyone who has questions can come to me. Okay? Sound good? Inshallah. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik, nastaghfirukallah wa natubu ilayk. The last thing is, always consult a scholar before taking your own exception into your own hands, because you should determine whether you fall into the exception category with the help of a scholar.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar.